The morning my boyfriend raised his hand to me, my father's response shattered what was left of my world. When I called him, trembling and desperate for comfort, he told me I should be grateful. That single conversation marked the end of everything I thought I knew about love, family, and my own worth. But to truly understand how I ended up there, I need to take you back to the beginning, to when I was just a little girl who still believed her father hung the moon. I was 8 years old when my mother passed away. The cancer took her slowly, then all at once, leaving my father and me adrift in a house that suddenly felt too big and too quiet. Those first few months after her funeral remain a blur of casseroles from neighbors, awkward hugs from relatives, and my father sitting in his study until the early hours of the morning, staring at photo albums. Margaret, my mother, had been the warm heart of our home. She was the one who sang while making pancakes on Sunday mornings, who turned grocery shopping into adventures, who could make even a rainy day feel like a gift. Without her, our house felt like a museum dedicated to happier times. My father, Richard, threw himself into raising me with the intensity of a man terrified of failing. At first, his dedication seemed like love. He quit his demanding job at the law firm to work from home, enrolled in parenting classes, and read every book about child development he could find. He packed elaborate lunches with handwritten notes, attended every school event, and instituted special daddy-daughter dinners every Friday night. To everyone looking in from the outside, he was the model single father, doing his absolute best under heartbreaking circumstances. But grief does strange things to people, and my father's grief transformed into something darker and more insidious than simple sadness. It started small, so small I didn't even notice at first. He began timing how long it took me to eat my meals, gently suggesting I should chew each bite 30 times for proper digestion. He started laying out my clothes each morning, choosing outfits that were always a bit more formal than what other kids wore to school. When I complained that I wanted to wear jeans like my friend Emma, he sat me down for a serious talk about how we present ourselves to the world and what that says about our character. By the time I turned 10, these quirks had evolved into rigid rules. The day I remember most clearly was a Saturday afternoon at a local restaurant. We'd gone out for lunch, a rare treat, and I was swinging my legs under the table, humming a song from a movie I'd seen at Emma's house. My father's voice cut through my daydream like a blade. "Lillian," he said, using my full name, which always meant I was in trouble. "Proper young ladies do not fidget. Close your legs and sit still." The couple at the next table glanced over, and I felt my cheeks burn with embarrassment. From that moment on, every meal became a performance, every bite scrutinized, every gesture evaluated against some invisible standard of perfection. The rules multiplied like weeds in an untended garden. By 12, I wasn't allowed to wear sneakers except during gym class. My father replaced them all with what he called appropriate footwear: Mary Janes for school, low heels for dinners, ballet flats for casual outings. He insisted it was about teaching me elegance and poise, preparing me for a successful future. When I protested that my feet hurt, that I couldn't run and play at recess, he would launch into speeches about how my mother had been the most graceful woman he'd ever known, how she could walk in heels for hours without complaint, how I dishonored her memory by being lazy and common. The manipulation was masterful in its subtlety. He never yelled, never raised his hand, never did anything that would raise obvious red flags. Instead, he wrapped his control in concern, his restrictions in love. When he instituted the dinner timer, 20 minutes to finish my meal or I'd skip breakfast the next day, he explained it was to teach me discipline and self-control, qualities that would serve me well in life. When he began inspecting my posture every morning, making me walk back and forth across the living room until my spine was perfectly straight, he said it was because he wanted me to command respect wherever I went. School became my only respite, those 7 hours when I could almost pretend to be a normal teenager. But even there, his influence followed me. I was the girl who never ran in gym class because I'd forgotten how to move freely in shoes with heels. I was the one who ate lunch alone because I was too embarrassed to explain why I couldn't accept invitations to sleepovers or birthday parties. My father had decided such events were distractions from my development. I excelled academically because studying was one of the few activities he approved of without reservation, burying myself in books to escape the suffocating reality of my home life. High school brought new challenges and new rules. Dating was absolutely forbidden, of course. My father explained that I needed to focus on becoming the kind of woman who would attract a quality man when the time was right. He enrolled me in etiquette classes where I learned the proper way to set a formal table, how to exit a car gracefully, and the art of conversation that never revealed too much or seemed too eager. The teacher, Mrs. Pemberton, was an elderly woman who seemed frozen in 1950s sensibilities. She praised my father for raising such a refined young lady, and he beamed with pride while I wanted to disappear into the floor. The other girls at school dated, went to parties, made mistakes, and learned from them. They dyed their hair crazy colors, pierced their ears multiple times, stayed out past curfew, and fought with their parents about normal teenage things. I watched from the sidelines, perfectly coiffed and utterly alone. My father had succeeded in making me different, special as he called it, but I would have traded all that supposed specialness for one night of feeling like I belonged. College was supposed to be my escape. I'd worked hard to earn a scholarship to a school 3 hours away, far enough that living at home wasn't practical. The battle to get there was epic. My father deployed every weapon in his arsenal: guilt, manipulation, threats, even tears. He suggested community college, online courses, anything that would keep me under his roof and his control. He painted terrifying pictures of what awaited young women on college campuses, stories of assault and ruin that he insisted were inevitable without his protection. "You're not ready," he said during one particularly intense confrontation. "Look at you. You can barely decide what to wear without my input. How will you handle real decisions?" The cruelty of it was that he was partially right. He had systematically removed my ability to make choices, and now he was using that learned helplessness as evidence that I needed continued control. But somewhere deep inside, beneath layers of conditioning and fear, a spark of my mother's spirit still flickered. Maybe it was her voice I heard when I stood my ground, when I filled out those scholarship applications, despite his disapproval, when I accepted my spot at the university. The night before I left for freshman orientation was charged with tension. He alternated between stony silence and desperate pleas, trying every emotional angle to make me stay. He sat on the edge of my bed that night, the same bed where he'd read me stories after my mother died, where he'd first told me about the importance of being special, and wept. "I've already lost one woman I love," he said through tears. "I can't lose you too." Even then, even knowing how he'd twisted his love into something suffocating, part of me wanted to comfort him. That's the insidious nature of this kind of abuse. It creates trauma bonds that make you feel responsible for your captor's emotions. "I'll call every Sunday," I promised, hating myself for the concession even as I made it. "I'll be careful. I'll make you proud." He gripped my hand so tightly it hurt. "You'll see," he said. "The world is cruel to women who don't know their place. But when it hurts you, and it will, I'll be here. I'll always be here." It sounded like a promise. Looking back, I recognize it as a threat. The 3-hour drive to campus the next morning was silent, except for his occasional sighs and my mother's favorite classical CD playing softly. He'd insisted on driving me, of course. One last act of control disguised as care. As we pulled up to my dorm, I saw other families unloading cars, parents hugging their children, siblings carrying boxes, normal families doing normal things. We looked normal too from the outside. No one could see the invisible chains I was trying to break. Those first few weeks of college freedom were a revelation and a terror. Everything was a choice. When to wake up, what to eat, where to go, who to talk to. After years of having every decision made for me, the abundance of options was paralyzing. I'd stand in the cafeteria, overwhelmed by the breakfast options, unable to choose between eggs and cereal because no one was telling me which was appropriate. I'd lie in bed past my alarm, marveling at the absence of consequences, then panic that I was doing freedom wrong. I bought a for the first. I didn't. He was all. Our first date was at an upscale restaurant near campus. Derek or when he walked when I entered, they bought the chain. He monitored the night as I've been thinking, he announced, dumping the bags onto my bed, about how you present yourself. Your father and I agree that you could do better. My blood ran cold as he began pulling out clothes: ankle-length skirts, oversized sweaters, loose-fitting dresses that looked like they belonged to someone decades older. "I took the liberty of updating your wardrobe. The inappropriate clothes you've been wearing are already in the dumpster behind your building." I stood there, unable to process what was happening. My clothes, the few pieces I'd bought with my own money that made me feel like myself, were gone. In their place were these shapeless, colorless garments that would erase any trace of individuality I'd managed to cultivate. "Derek," I started, trying to keep my voice steady, "you had no right. The slap came so fast I didn't see it coming." My cheek exploded with pain, and I stumbled backward, my hand flying to my face. The room spun as I tried to reconcile the throbbing in my jaw with the reality that someone who claimed to love me had just hit me. Derek's face showed no remorse, only irritation. A simple thank you would suffice, he said coldly. I spent $800 on you, and this is how you respond? Through the shock and pain, my survival instincts kicked in. I knew from years of managing my father's moods that escalation would only make things worse. Thank you, I managed to whisper, hating myself for the words even as they left my mouth. Derek's face immediately softened, and he pulled me into an embrace that made my skin crawl. That's my good girl, he murmured into my hair. I only want what's best for you. You know that, right? After he left, I collapsed onto my bed and sobbed. The tears came in waves, for the girl I'd tried to become, for the freedom I'd tasted and lost, for my mother who would have been horrified to see what my life had become. When the tears finally stopped, I knew I needed help. With shaking hands, I called the one person who was supposed to protect me, who was supposed to love me unconditionally. I called my father. The phone rang 3 times before he answered, his voice warm with pleasure at hearing from me outside our scheduled Sunday call. I struggled to find the words, to explain what had happened. When I finally managed to tell him that Derek had hit me, there was a long silence on the other end. Then, to my horror, he chuckled. Well, he said, his tone light as if we were discussing the weather. What did you do to provoke him? I couldn't speak. The betrayal was so complete, so devastating that it literally stole my voice. My father continued, warming to his theme. Derek is a good man, Lillian. If he felt the need to correct you, then you must have pushed him too far. Men don't just lose control for no reason. You need to take responsibility for your actions. Each word was a nail in the coffin of any remaining hope I had that my father would protect me. Are you listening to me? His voice sharpened when I didn't respond. I made some sound of acknowledgement and his tone became pleased again. Good girl. Now, when Derek comes back, I want you to apologize properly and thank him. He's putting in the effort to make you into the kind of woman a man like him deserves. You owe him gratitude, not attitude. I hung up without saying goodbye. In that moment, something fundamental shifted inside me. The programming, the rules, the careful construction of who I was supposed to be. It all shattered like glass. I sat on my bed, surrounded by the expensive clothes Derek had bought to erase me, and I made a decision. I was done. Done being controlled. Done being molded. Done being anything other than myself. Breaking up with Derek required planning. I knew enough about abusive relationships from the research I'd started doing that night to know leaving could be dangerous. I texted him a simple message. This isn't working. We're over. Please don't contact me again. Then I blocked his number, his social media, everything. It felt like cutting off a diseased limb, painful but necessary for survival. The next step was harder. I drove the 3 hours to my father's house, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles went white. I'd practiced what I would say 100 times, but when I pulled into the driveway of my childhood home, all those carefully prepared words evaporated. The house looked exactly the same. Pristine lawn, perfectly trimmed hedges, everything in its proper place. Just like he'd always wanted me to be. I expected anger when I told him I'd broken up with Derek. I expected disappointment, manipulation, maybe even tears. What I didn't expect was the casual, "Oh, okay," he offered before falling silent. We sat in his living room, the space where he'd made me practice walking with books on my head, where he'd timed my meal consumption, where he'd systematically destroyed my sense of self in the name of love. The silence stretched between us, heavy with years of unspoken truths. Finally, he suggested we have dinner together in a few days, just the two of us, to talk things through. I should have known better. I should have recognized the calm before the storm. But some part of me, the little girl who still wanted her daddy's approval, agreed. Maybe, I thought, he was finally ready to hear me, to understand the damage he'd done, to start building something healthier between us. When I arrived for dinner 3 days later, I knew immediately that I'd walked into a trap. Derek's car was in the driveway, parked behind mine to block me in. My fight-or-flight response kicked into overdrive, but I forced myself to remain calm. Running would only delay the inevitable confrontation. Instead, I walked to the front door with my head high, my phone recording in my pocket, ready to face whatever orchestrated intervention they'd planned. Derek answered the door with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Well, if it isn't the woman of the hour," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Your father and I have been having quite the conversation about your recent behavior." Behind him, I could see my father in the living room, sitting in his favorite chair like a king holding court. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I walked through that door anyway. I'd spent my entire life running from confrontations, bending to their will, making myself smaller to fit into the boxes they'd constructed for me. Not anymore. Walked past Derek without acknowledging him and addressed my father directly. Dad, I said, my voice stronger than I felt. Thank you for this opportunity. You're right, I have been ungrateful. The words had their intended effect. Both men relaxed, exchanging pleased looks, certain they'd won. I walked over to Derek and gave him a chaste kiss on the cheek, playing the part they expected one last time. What they didn't know was that my phone was recording everything, that I'd already been in touch with campus security about my situation, that this performance was not submission, but strategy. The rest of the evening was a masterclass in manipulation from both of them. They took turns explaining how disappointed they were in my behavior, how I'd been led astray by radical influences at college, how lucky I was to have two men who cared enough to correct my path. They outlined their plan. Derek and I would get back together, I would transfer to a college closer to home, and after graduation, we would marry. My father had already started planning the wedding, apparently, having put a deposit down on the country club where he and my mother had married. I nodded along, made appropriate sounds of agreement, even apologized for my rebellion. They were so pleased with themselves, so certain of their victory, that they didn't notice I never actually agreed to their plan. When I finally said I needed to leave to get back to campus, Derek walked me to my car. I'm glad you've come to your senses, he said, leaning in close enough that I could smell his cologne, a scent that would make me nauseous for years afterward. I'll be checking in on you. Your father gave me your class schedule. The moment I was out of sight of the house, I pulled over and called campus security. The recording I'd made was clear. Two men discussing how they planned to control and monitor me, how they'd work together to ensure my compliance. The security officer I spoke with took my concerns seriously, especially when I mentioned Derek's previous physical assault. They helped me file for an emergency restraining order and change my dorm room to one in a more secure building. The next few weeks were a blur of legal procedures, safety planning, and the slow process of rebuilding my sense of self. The restraining order against Derek was granted quickly, especially after the police heard the recording from my father's house. The campus took additional steps to ensure my safety, alerting my professors to the situation, providing an escort service for evening classes, and connecting me with counseling services. The hardest part wasn't the legal proceedings or the safety measures, it was the emotional aftermath. I'd been programmed since childhood to believe that love looked like control, that protection meant restriction, that being special meant being isolated. Unlearning those lessons was like performing surgery on myself without anesthesia. Every choice I made, what to wear, what to eat, how to sit, required conscious thought and the deliberate rejection of years of conditioning. My father's attempts to contact me escalated quickly. When I didn't return his calls, he began showing up at my college. The first time, security turned him away. The second time, he waited outside my workplace, a small bookstore near campus where I'd gotten a part-time job. He approached me as I was leaving, trying to convince me to get in his car so we could talk like civilized people. When I refused and started walking away, he grabbed my arm hard enough to leave bruises. A coworker witnessed the incident and called the police. As they led my father away, he kept insisting he was just trying to help me, that I was making a terrible mistake, that I needed him. It was perhaps the first time in my life I'd seen him completely lose control of a situation, and instead of feeling sympathy, I felt relief. The mask had finally slipped, and others could see what I'd always known was underneath. The restraining order against my father was more complicated emotionally than the one against Derek. This was the man who had raised me, who had been my only parent for over a decade. Despite everything, part of me still loved him, still wanted to believe that somewhere inside was the dad who had taught me to ride a bike, who had read me bedtime stories, who had held me while I cried for my mother. Reconciling that person with the controlling, manipulative man he'd become was a grief all its own. I threw myself into building a new life, though threw myself makes it sound easier than it was. The truth is, I crawled toward freedom, sometimes taking steps backward, sometimes frozen in place by fear. Those first attempts at normal college life were terrifying. I remember standing outside a party for 20 minutes, trying to convince myself to go in. The music was loud, people were laughing, and all I could think about was how disappointed my father would be. When I finally walked through that door, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the red Solo cup someone handed me. Making friends, real friends who liked me for who I was, not who I pretended to be. required learning an entirely new language. I'd become so accustomed to monitoring every word, calibrating every response to avoid conflict or disappointment, that genuine conversation felt foreign. My first real friend at college was Emma, a loud, chaotic art major who wore paint-stained overalls and had opinions about everything. She'd plop down next to me at lunch, completely oblivious to my rigid posture, and launch into stories about her terrible date or her latest creative project. "Why do you eat so fast?" she asked one day, watching me methodically clean my plate. I froze, the old fear rising. But something in her face, genuine curiosity, not judgment, made me tell the truth. "I was trained to," I said quietly. "If I didn't finish in 20 minutes, I couldn't eat the next day." Emma's fork clattered to her tray. "That's fucked up," she said simply. And somehow, that blunt acknowledgement did more to validate my experience than hours of careful sympathy could have. Through Emma, I met others. Sarah, the pre-med student who taught me it was okay to be smart without apologizing for it. Marcus, the gentle philosophy major who would later become my first attempt at healthy dating. Jasmine, the theater kid who insisted I try out for a play, ignoring my protest that I didn't know how to be anything other than perfectly composed. That little group became my laboratory for learning how to be human again. They called me out when I apologized unnecessarily, celebrated when I expressed a strong opinion, and never once made me feel like I was too much or not enough. The therapy journey was its own mountain to climb. Finding the right therapist took 3 tries. The first one, an older man who reminded me too much of my father, kept insisting I must want to reconcile with my family eventually. The second, though well-meaning, seemed overwhelmed by my story and kept looking at me with such pity that I felt more broken than before. The third, Dr. Patricia Ruiz, was exactly what I needed. A survivor herself, she understood the complex dynamics of family trauma without either minimizing or dramatizing my experience. Our sessions were hard work disguised as conversation. Ruiz had a way of asking questions that unlocked rooms in my mind I'd sealed shut. "Tell me about a time you felt powerful as a child," she said during our third session. I sat in silence for so long she probably thought I wouldn't answer. Finally, I remembered. I was 7. My mother was still alive. I'd climbed to the top of the jungle gym at the park, higher than I'd ever been. She was watching from below, and instead of telling me to be careful or come down, she just smiled and waved. I felt like I could fly. "And after she died?" Dr. Ruiz prompted gently. "I never climbed that high again. My father said it was too dangerous." We sat with that for a moment, the metaphor hanging between us like a bridge I wasn't quite ready to cross. Session by session, we unpacked years of manipulation and control, learned terms I'd never heard before: gaslighting, enmeshment, parentification, trauma bonding. Each label helped me understand that what happened to me wasn't unique or my fault. It was part of a pattern, predictable and tragic. We identified the voices in my head, separating my authentic thoughts from the programming my father had installed. It was like debugging corrupted software, finding each malicious line of code and carefully removing it. The physical work of healing was just as important. Years of rigid posture and restricted movement had left my body locked in permanent tension. Dr. Ruiz recommended a somatic therapist who specialized in helping trauma survivors reconnect with their bodies. The first session, I couldn't even identify where I was holding tension. My entire body was one clenched fist. Slowly, through breathing exercises and gentle movement, I began to inhabit my own skin again. I joined a dance class, not ballet or anything formal, but a free-form movement class where the only rule was to move however felt good. The first class, I stood frozen in the corner while others swayed and spun around me. By the third class, I managed to sway slightly. By the 10th, I was spinning with my arms outstretched, hair flying, feeling something I hadn't felt since standing on top of that jungle gym. Powerful. Every small act of autonomy felt like a victory because it was. The first time I slept past noon on a Saturday, I woke up expecting punishment that never came. When I ate ice cream for dinner while studying for finals, I had to actively remind myself that no one was timing me, no one was watching, no one would withhold tomorrow's meals. I started keeping a journal of these small rebellions, evidence that I was becoming my own person. Today, I wore sweatpants to the library. Today, I laughed loudly in the cafeteria. Today, I said no to something without explaining why. The red sneakers became my symbol of freedom. I wore them everywhere, to class, to therapy, to court appearances. They were bright and comfortable and completely impractical for anything other than being myself. Some days, when the weight of everything threatened to crush me, I would look down at those ridiculous red shoes and remember that I had chosen them, that I could choose my own path. 3 months after the restraining orders were in place, I thought things were finally stabilizing. I was doing well in my classes, had made genuine friends, and was starting to feel like maybe I could build a life free from the shadow of my past. Then I came home to find a package outside my door with no return address. Inside was my mother's charm bracelet, a delicate silver chain with tiny charms she'd collected over the years, a ballet slipper from her childhood dance classes, a tiny book representing her love of reading, a heart my father had given her when they were dating. The note with it was in my father's handwriting. "Thought you might want this back. Consider it a peace offering, Dad." I held the bracelet and sobbed. It was the one thing of my mother's I'd wanted to take with me to college, but I'd been too afraid to ask, knowing my father would use it as leverage. Now here it was, a reminder of the woman whose death had started our family's descent into dysfunction. I showed the package to my therapist at our next session. She helped me see it for what it was, not a genuine peace offering, but another attempt at manipulation, using my mother's memory to try to draw me back in. We talked about the complicated grief of losing a parent twice, once to death and once to their transformation into someone unrecognizable. That night, I put on the bracelet and looked at myself in the mirror. I saw my mother in the shape of my eyes, the curve of my smile. But I also saw myself, stronger than I'd ever imagined I could be, scarred but not broken. I made a promise to her memory and to myself that I would not let my father's version of love define my life any longer. The next few months brought a series of escalations from both Derek and my father. Derek, facing academic suspension due to the restraining order and assault charges, began a social media campaign to discredit me. He painted himself as the victim of false accusations, claiming I had manipulated him and was now trying to destroy his future. His fraternity brothers joined in, flooding my social media with hateful messages and threats. My father took a different approach. He began reaching out to extended family members, painting me as mentally unstable, possibly on drugs, in need of intervention. I started getting calls from aunts and uncles I hadn't spoken to in years, all concerned about my breakdown and urging me to reconcile with my father. It was exhausting, having to defend my sanity and my choices over and over again. The turning point came when Derek was arrested for violating the restraining order. He'd been caught on security cameras lurking outside my new dorm at 3 a.m. When the police searched his car, they found rope, zip ties, and a detailed plan of my daily routine. The reality of how much danger I'd been in hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't just about control anymore. It had escalated to something far more sinister. Derek's arrest made the local news, which brought an unexpected silver lining. Other women began reaching out to me, former girlfriends of Derek's who had similar stories of control and abuse, but had been too afraid to come forward. Together, we formed a support network, sharing our experiences and supporting each other through the legal process. It turned out Derek had a pattern, and I was just the first one to fight back publicly. My father's reaction to Derek's arrest was telling. Instead of expressing concern for my safety, he called to lecture me about ruining a good man's future. That was the last time I spoke to him directly. I let all my some of them, as the 1-year anniversary of that first slap approached, I decided to take a symbolic step in reclaiming my narrative. I legally changed my name from Lillian, the name my father had insisted on using despite my mother calling me Lily, to just Lily. It was a small thing, but it felt monumental. I was no longer the girl my father had tried to create. I was Lily, choosing my own identity, one decision at a time. The final court hearing for Derek's case came on a crisp autumn day. I sat in the courtroom surrounded by my support system, friends from school, my therapist, and several of Derek's other victims who had found the courage to testify. Derek, looking diminished in his orange jumpsuit, avoided eye contact with all of us. His parents sat behind him, his mother crying softly while his father stared straight ahead, jaw clenched. When it was my turn to give my victim impact statement, I stood on shaking legs and spoke my truth. I talked about the erosion of self that comes with controlling relationships, the way abuse masquerades as love, the long journey of healing that I was still walking. I spoke not just for myself, but for every woman who had been made to feel small, crazy, or ungrateful for wanting basic autonomy. By the time I finished, I wasn't shaking anymore. Derek was sentenced to 2 years in prison with mandatory counseling and a permanent protective order upon release. It wasn't as long as some had hoped, But it was accountability, something I'd never thought I'd see. As they led him away, he finally looked at me, and I saw something I'd never seen before: fear. He was no longer the one in control, and he didn't know how to handle it. Walking out of the courthouse, I felt a chapter closing. Derek would no longer be a daily threat in my life, but my father remained a complicated, unresolved pain. The restraining order against him was still in effect, but I knew that legal documents couldn't heal the deeper wounds of having a parent who saw me as a possession rather than a person. 6 months later, I got the call that my father had been hospitalized with a heart attack. My Aunt Catherine, his sister, delivered the news with careful neutrality, knowing about the restraining order, but also knowing the complicated nature of family bonds. She said he was stable but had been asking for me. I sat with that information for hours, turning it over in my mind like a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit. My therapist and I had many sessions about this moment. We discussed how I might feel if something happened to my father while we were estranged, the guilt and complicated grief that might arise. Now faced with the reality, I found myself surprisingly clear-headed. I decided to visit him, not out of obligation or manipulation, but because I needed to see him one more time, to say what needed to be said. I brought my friend Sarah with me to the hospital. She waited outside while I entered his room. My father looked smaller than I remembered, older, more fragile. When he saw me, his eyes filled with tears. For the first time since my mother's death, he looked truly vulnerable. We talked for 20 minutes, not about reconciliation or forgiveness, but about truth. He admitted that after my mother died, he'd become consumed with preventing me from experiencing any harm, not realizing he'd become the harm himself. It wasn't an excuse, just an acknowledgement. I left that hospital room feeling lighter, not healed, not forgiving, but no longer carrying the weight of unspoken words. I told him the restraining order would remain in place, that I needed to continue my journey without him, but that I hoped he would get help. He nodded, looking defeated, but perhaps for the first time, understanding. That was 2 years ago. I graduated college with honors, surrounded by chosen family who celebrated my achievements without trying to control my future. I work now as an advocate for domestic violence survivors, using my story to help others recognize the signs of controlling behavior before it escalates. I still wear red sneakers almost every day, different pairs now, but always red, always comfortable, always my choice. My father sends a letter every Christmas through my aunt. I don't read them anymore, but I don't throw them away either. They sit in a box in my closet, a reminder of the complicated nature of love and loss. Derek is out of prison now, living in another state with strict conditions on his release. I occasionally Google his name, not out of fear, but to remind myself how far I've come from the girl who thanked him for hitting her. Healing isn't linear. There are days when I catch myself sitting too straight, eating too fast, apologizing for taking up space. Old programming dies hard, but there are more days when I lounge comfortably, eat dessert first, speak my mind without fear. I've learned to love fiercely, but with boundaries, to trust, but with wisdom, to forgive, but not forget. My mother's charm bracelet still sits on my wrist, joined now by charms of my own choosing. A tiny pair of sneakers, a key representing freedom, a phoenix for rebirth. Sometimes I talk to her when I'm alone, telling her about my life, my choices, my mistakes, and my triumphs. I like to think she would be proud of the woman I've become, not perfect or polished, but real and free. To anyone reading this who sees themselves in my story, who recognizes the slow erosion of self that comes with controlling love, know this: you deserve autonomy. You deserve to make mistakes. You deserve to be loved for who you are, not who someone else thinks you should be. The path to freedom is terrifying and lonely and the hardest thing you'll ever do. But on the other side is a life where you get to choose your clothes, your food, your future, yourself. I've learned that healing happens in the smallest moments. It's in the first time you order what you actually want at a restaurant without calculating calories or propriety. It's in laughing so loud that people turn to look and not caring one bit. It's in wearing mismatched socks because they make you happy, in dancing badly to your favorite song, in saying no without offering an explanation. These tiny rebellions against a lifetime of control add up to something profound, a life lived on your own terms. My work with domestic violence survivors has shown me how universal these patterns are. Every week, I meet women who echo my younger self, accomplished, intelligent women who've been convinced they're never quite good enough, that they need constant correction and guidance. We sit in circles in community centers and church basements, sharing our stories and slowly unraveling the lies we've been told about ourselves. The first time someone says it wasn't my fault and truly believes it, the entire room shifts. That moment of clarity is contagious, spreading from one survivor to another like light breaking through clouds. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from constantly monitoring yourself, from running every action through a filter of, what will he think? And is this acceptable? I see it in the women who come to our support groups. They're tired in their bones, worn down by years of hypervigilance. We talk about reclaiming rest, about the radical act of relaxation when you've been programmed to always be performing. The first time I took a nap in the middle of the day just because I felt like it, I cried afterward. Such a simple thing, but it represented a freedom I'd never known. The ripple effects of trauma extend far beyond the primary relationship. I've had to relearn how to exist in every area of my life. Professional settings were particularly challenging. I'd been trained to be decorative and demure, to never outshine or challenge male authority. My first real job after college, I found myself automatically deferring to male colleagues, softening my opinions with qualifiers, apologizing for having ideas. My female boss, a brilliant woman named Diana who'd built her career in tech, took me aside after a particularly painful meeting where I'd let a male intern talk over me repeatedly. "Lily," she said, not unkindly, "you're brilliant, but you're hiding it. Whatever voice in your head is telling you to shrink, it's lying." She became my mentor, teaching me not just about our industry, but about taking up space, about the difference between confidence and arrogance, about how to disagree professionally without apologizing for existing. Under her guidance, I learned to present my ideas without hedging, to accept compliments without deflecting, to negotiate my salary without feeling greedy. Each small victory in the workplace felt like reclaiming a piece of myself that had been systematically erased. Romantic relationships after trauma are their own particular minefield. For the longest time, I couldn't even consider dating. The thought of being vulnerable with another person, of potentially walking back into a cage, was paralyzing. When friends would try to set me up, I'd make excuses. Too busy with work, focused on healing, not ready yet. The truth was more complicated. I didn't trust my own judgment anymore. If I'd been so wrong about Derek, how could I ever trust myself to choose a safe partner? It took 3 years before I went on another date. His name was Marcus, and he was everything Derek wasn't: soft-spoken, patient, genuinely interested in my thoughts and feelings. Our first date was coffee in the afternoon, public and safe with an easy exit strategy. I'd told him up front about my history, not the details, but enough so he understood why I might be skittish. His response was perfect. "Thank you for trusting me with that. We can go as slow as you need." Even with Marcus's patience and understanding, I struggled. When he complimented my outfit, I heard criticism of all the other things I'd worn. When he suggested a restaurant, I wondered if he was starting to control where we went. When he texted to say good morning, I analyzed it for signs of monitoring my schedule. My trauma had installed a translator in my brain that converted every normal interaction into a potential threat. Marcus never complained, never pushed, but after 6 months, I could see the toll my hypervigilance was taking on both of us. "I can't be in a relationship yet," I told him over dinner at the same coffee shop where we'd had our first date. "It's not fair to you, and it's not healthy for me." He reached across the table and squeezed my hand gently. "I understand," he said, and I could see that he did. "If you ever feel ready, I hope you'll call me. And if not, I'm glad I got to know you." We parted as friends, and while it hurt, it was a clean pain. Nothing like the twisted agony of my past relationships. That experience taught me something crucial. Healing couldn't be rushed to meet someone else's timeline, not even someone as kind as Marcus. I needed to learn to be alone without being lonely, to be single without feeling incomplete. I threw myself into building a life that was full and rich entirely on my own terms. I took pottery classes and made lopsided bowls that I displayed proudly. I joined a hiking club and discovered I loved being outdoors when I could wear appropriate shoes. I adopted a rescue cat named Ginger, who had no interest in my posture or mealtimes, only in whether I would share my tuna sandwich. My relationship with food required its own healing journey. Years of timed meals and restricted portions had left me disconnected from my body's actual needs. I'd forgotten what hunger felt like versus what the clock said, what satisfaction meant versus cleaning my plate in the allotted time. Working with a nutritionist who specialized in disordered eating, I slowly relearned how to eat intuitively, The first time I left food on my plate simply because I was full, not because time had run out, it felt like a revolution. There were setbacks, of course. Healing isn't a straight line from broken to whole. There was the time I ran into one of Derek's fraternity brothers at a grocery store, and his sneering, "Hey, isn't that the crazy chick who tried to ruin Derek's life?" sent me spiraling for days. There was the family reunion I attempted to attend, only to leave when relatives who'd been poisoned by my father's narrative treated me like a pariah. There was the panic attack in a department store when a well-meaning saleswoman insisted I try on heels, triggering memories of my father's shoe purges. But for every setback, there were moments of triumph. The day I testified before a state legislative committee about the need for better domestic violence protections, my voice steady and clear. The afternoon, I helped a young woman recognize the warning signs in her own relationship and connected her with resources before it escalated to violence. The morning I woke up and realized I'd gone a full week without thinking about my father or Derek, too busy living my own life to dwell on those who'd tried to control it. 5 years after that phone call, where my father told me to thank Derek for hitting me, I received unexpected news. My Aunt Catherine called to tell me my father had been diagnosed with early onset dementia. The strong, controlling man who had orchestrated every aspect of my childhood was losing his grip on his own mind. The irony wasn't lost on me. After years of trying to control everything around him, he was losing control of himself. Catherine asked if I wanted to know more, if I wanted updates as his condition progressed. I sat with that question for a long time. Part of me wanted to say yes, to keep some thread of connection to the man who, despite everything, was still my father. But I knew that thread could too easily become a rope, pulling me back into dynamics I'd worked so hard to escape. No, I finally told her, but thank you for asking. That decision led to another round of therapy, processing the complicated grief of losing a parent who was still alive. My therapist helped me understand that I was mourning multiple losses: the father I'd had before my mother died, the father I wished he could have been, and now the possibility of any future reconciliation. It was okay to grieve those losses while still maintaining the boundaries that kept me safe. Around this time, I also began exploring my mother's history more deeply. I reached out to her old friends, people my father had cut out of our lives after her death. Through them, I learned about the woman she'd been beyond being my mother and his wife. Margaret had been an artist, a volunteer at the animal shelter, a woman who loved to dance badly at weddings and laugh loudly at inappropriate jokes. She'd been planning to go back to school when she got sick, wanting to become an art therapist. These revelations made me mourn her loss anew, but also helped me understand that the free spirit my father had tried to crush in me was inherited from her. One of my mother's friends, Linda, shared something that shifted my perspective. "Your mother worried about your father's intensity," she told me over tea. Even before she got sick, she'd noticed how rigid he could be, how he needed to control things. She made him promise to let you be yourself, to not try to mold you into his idea of perfect. That promise, I realized, had died with her. In his grief and fear, my father had done exactly what she'd feared, turning his anxiety into a prison for me. This knowledge didn't excuse his behavior, but it added a layer of tragedy to our story. My father hadn't started out as a villain. He'd been a grieving widower terrified of losing his daughter, too. But somewhere along the way, that fear had metastasized into something toxic, destroying the very relationship he'd been so desperate to preserve. It was a cautionary tale about how love without respect becomes control, how protection without trust becomes imprisonment. As I built my new life, I found unexpected joy in the mundane choices that had once been made for me. Grocery shopping became an adventure in agency, buying whatever cereal looked good, trying new foods without researching their propriety, eating breakfast for dinner just because I could. I painted my apartment in bright, bold colors that would have horrified my father. I hung art that made me happy, not what was considered tasteful. I created a space that was entirely mine, reflecting my personality in every corner. Dating eventually became possible again, though it looked different than before. I was drawn to partners who celebrated my independence rather than trying to contain it. There was Jasmine, the chef who taught me to cook with joy rather than precision. There was David, the teacher who loved how loudly I laughed at his terrible jokes. There was Sam, the social worker who understood trauma and never made me feel broken for carrying mine. None of these relationships lasted forever, but each one taught me more about what healthy love could look like. Through it all, those red sneakers remained my touchstone. I'd worn through several pairs by now, each one replaced with another bold, comfortable pair. They'd become something of a signature, Colleagues knew me as the woman with the red sneakers, and I wore that identity with pride. When I started speaking at conferences about recognizing and escaping controlling relationships, I always wore red sneakers on stage. They were my armor, my rebellion, my reminder that I had chosen my own path. The impact of sharing my story publicly was something I hadn't anticipated. After my first speaking engagement, a woman approached me in tears. "I thought I was crazy," she said. "My husband doesn't hit me, but everything else you described, the timing meals, the clothing control, the isolation, that's my life." We talked for an hour, and I connected her with resources. 6 months later, she sent me an email with a photo of her own red sneakers. "Free at last," was all it said. I printed that email and kept it in my desk drawer for the days when the work felt too heavy. There were dozens of similar stories. Women who recognized themselves in my experience, who'd been told they were ungrateful for wanting autonomy, who'd been slowly erased by someone claiming to love them. Men, too, though fewer came forward publicly, trapped in their own versions of controlling relationships with nowhere to turn. Each story reinforced that what happened to me wasn't unique or isolated. It was part of a larger pattern of how control masquerades as care, how abuse hides behind concern. The work was healing, but also challenging. There were days when the stories I heard triggered my own memories, when I had to excuse myself from sessions to breathe through flashbacks. I learned the importance of having my own support system, of not trying to be anyone's savior, of maintaining boundaries even in helping professions. My supervisor, herself a survivor, taught me about sustainable advocacy. "You can't pour from an empty cup," she'd remind me. "Taking care of yourself isn't selfish. It's necessary." 10 years have now passed since I hung up on my father that night, a full decade of freedom, growth, setbacks, and triumphs. I'm in my early 30s now, living a life teenage me could never have imagined. I have a career I'm passionate about, friendships built on mutual respect, and a relationship with myself that's grounded in compassion rather than criticism. The hypervigilance has faded to occasional whispers rather than constant screams. The need to monitor every action, every word, every bite of food has been replaced by trust in my own judgment. There are still echoes of the past. I sometimes catch myself sitting too straight and have to consciously relax. Certain phrases, "Good girl, you should be grateful," "for your own good," still make my skin crawl. I haven't attended a family gathering in years, chose family over blood relations who refuse to see the truth. These aren't failures, they're boundaries, evidence of hard-won self-protection. Recently, I received another letter through my aunt, different from the usual Christmas notes. My father, deep in dementia now, had written me a rambling message that jumped between time periods. In one paragraph, I was 8 years old and he was teaching me to tie my shoes. In another, he was angry about my rebellion, though he couldn't seem to remember what I'd done. But there was one lucid line that stopped me cold. "I'm sorry I couldn't let you wear the red shoes." He'd remembered. Somewhere in his fragmenting mind, he'd held on to that symbol of everything he'd taken from me. I sat with that letter for a long time, not sure what to feel. It wasn't the apology I'd once desperately wanted. He likely wouldn't even remember writing it. But it was acknowledgement of a sort, evidence that even he knew, on some level, what he'd done. I didn't respond to the letter, but I did something else. I went to the cemetery where my mother was buried, a place I'd avoided for years because my father had controlled even how we grieved. I sat by her headstone wearing red sneakers and told her everything. I told her about the girl I'd been, the woman I'd become, the journey between the two. I told her about the lives I'd helped change, the story I'd refused to let define me, the freedom I'd fought for and won. I left a small charm at her grave, a tiny red shoe to match the ones on my feet. As I walked away from the cemetery, I thought about the circular nature of healing, how we spiral back to old wounds with new wisdom, each pass-through making us stronger. I thought about the other women out there, sitting at perfectly set tables, timing their meals, afraid to speak too loudly or laugh too freely. I thought about the children watching their mothers shrink, learning that love means becoming smaller. And I renewed my commitment to keep telling my story, to keep shining light into those dark corners where control hides as care. My life now is beautiful in its imperfection. My apartment is often messy. My meals are eaten whenever I'm hungry. My clothes are chosen for joy rather than propriety. I laugh too loudly, take up space, express opinions without apology. I've learned to love fiercely, but never at the cost of myself. I've discovered that real strength isn't in perfection, but in authenticity. Not in control, but in trust. Not in isolation, but in connection. To those still trapped in relationships that make them feel small, crazy, or ungrateful for wanting basic autonomy, please know this: you deserve to wear whatever shoes make you happy. You deserve to eat when you're hungry and stop when you're full. You deserve to laugh loudly, to have opinions, to make mistakes, to be human. The voice telling you otherwise, whether it comes from a parent, a partner, or the echo in your own head, is lying. Freedom is terrifying, yes, but captivity is worse. And on the other side of that fear is a life you can't yet imagine, one where every choice is yours to make. That's my story, still unfolding, still being written with each day I choose myself. It's not a fairy tale with a neat ending, but something better. A real life, messy and complicated and entirely mine. Every morning, I lace up my red sneakers and step into a world full of possibilities. And that simple act, that small choice that was once forbidden, remains the most powerful rebellion of all. Because healing, I've learned, happens one step at a time, one choice at a time, one breath at a time. And every step in those red sneakers takes me further from who I was forced to be, and closer to who I choose to become.